A proud new homeowner moves into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was everything he had dreamed of for years. A classic two-story with warm brickwork, white trim and a wide front yard that curved gently toward the street. It wasn't just a purchase for him, it was the culmination of sacrifices, overtime hours, and a relentless focus on saving. He had grown up in a cramped apartment where there was no yard, no driveway, no space to call his own, and the moment he turned the key in the lock of this new house, he felt an almost physical weight lift from his shoulders. The neighborhood itself looked like a brochure for suburban peace. Maple trees lined both sides of the street, and kids rode their bikes without fear of traffic. Neighbors waved when you drove past. On Sunday mornings you could hear sprinklers ticking like clocks and smell fresh coffee from open windows. For him this wasn't just a house in a development, it was a sign he had finally arrived at a place he had once only imagined. He spent his first nights walking the property line, getting to know the space the way a captain might get to know his ship. He noticed how the morning sun lit up the east side of the house, where he planned to build a small garden, and how the west side stayed cool under the shade of an old oak tree. Every square foot represented potential. Cookouts with friends, quiet evenings on the porch, a safe yard for kids someday. The neighbors seemed friendly enough at first glance. A retired couple waved from their porch across the street. 2 houses down, a family of 4 played basketball in their driveway, and directly opposite his front yard stood another 2-story house, larger and slightly older than his, with a perfectly manicured lawn that spoke of careful hands and rigid schedules. That was the home of the woman who ran the neighborhood homeowners association. He didn't think much about it then. In the moving boxes stacked by the door, there were no trophies, no heirlooms, only the essentials he had carried from one rental to another: a couch, a television, a few worn pots and pans. But now he had space to fill, walls to paint, rooms to claim. More than anything, he had a yard, a blank canvas of soil and grass he could shape into something beautiful. He had always believed that a home should tell a story, and he wanted this one to say, "Here lives someone who takes pride in where he lives, someone who worked for." His first week was filled with small acts of ownership. He mowed the grass himself rather than hire a service. He swept the driveway clean, patched a loose board on the porch, and introduced himself to a few neighbors. He noticed that cars rarely drove fast down the street, which gave the whole area a slower, calmer rhythm. In those early days, he told himself that he'd found not only a home but a community. He imagined block parties, shared tools, maybe even friendships built over fences and lawns. At night, with the windows open and crickets chirping, he felt at peace for the first time in years. He pours months of hard work and savings into creating a pristine lawn. From the moment he unpacked his last box, the yard became his obsession. Each evening after work he would change into old jeans and a faded t-shirt, step outside with a rake or a shovel, and lose himself in the rhythm of care. He aerated the soil, hauled in bags of topsoil, and seeded bare patches by hand. Weekends were spent at garden centers, comparing different types of fertilizer, testing blends of grass seed suited to the local climate, and speaking with older gardeners about tricks they'd learned over decades. He didn't just want a decent yard, he wanted one that reflected the same discipline and pride that had gotten him here. He installed a new irrigation system on his own, crawling on hands and knees to lay out the line. Early mornings found him kneeling in the dew, checking the spray pattern of sprinklers, and adjusting nozzles so every inch would receive the same care. He researched native plants that would thrive along the edges, and planned flower beds that would bloom in succession through the season. When a neighbor asked why he didn't just hire landscapers like everyone else, he smiled and said, "Because I want to build it myself." Every improvement felt like progress, a visible sign that he was shaping his environment rather than renting it. His palms developed calluses from the work, and his garage filled with tools he had never needed before: edging shears, soil testers, spreaders. On Saturdays he could be seen pushing a heavy mower in straight, perfect lines, the smell of cut grass following him like a badge of honor. He began to earn nods of approval from passers-by, small compliments shouted from car windows: "Nice yard, looking sharp," and each one spurred him to keep going. He invested in ornamental shrubs to flank the walkway, and planted a row of young trees along the property line, envisioning how they would someday provide shade and privacy. He built a small wooden bench beneath the oak on the west side of the yard, imagining future afternoons spent reading. By late spring the once plain front yard had transformed into a lush green carpet, bordered by clean mulch beds and bursts of color from seasonal flowers. It wasn't just about appearances. Working on the yard gave him a sense of control and peace. Sometimes after dusk, he would stand at the edge of the street, looking back at the house with its lit windows and neat lawn, and feel an almost electric pride. The yard wasn't perfect yet, but it was becoming his signature. Neighbors who had once barely nodded, now slowed their evening walks to chat and ask for tips. A few joked that his lawn made the rest of them look lazy. He laughed but felt secretly proud. It wasn't only sweat equity he poured into the project. It was also money. Each paycheck he set aside a portion for upgrades. Better soil, a more efficient mower, high-quality seed. Friends questioned why he spent so much on grass when he had a whole house to furnish. But for him the yard was the first impression, the handshake of the home. Creating something beautiful from the earth gave him a sense of purpose that no furniture purchase could match. What he didn't realize then was that all this effort would soon be tested in a way he never expected. His green sanctuary, built with care and intention, would become the very ground over which a battle of respect and boundaries would play out. Across the street lives the HOA president, a woman known for enforcing rules on others. Her house stood like a monument to control and precision. The hedges in front of it were clipped so square they looked like green blocks, and the driveway was always spotless, no matter the weather. She had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, and her reputation preceded her. Residents whispered about how she sent warning letters for leaving trash cans out an hour too long or for hanging holiday lights past the approved date. She was in her late 40s, tall and brisk in her movements, with a permanent look of appraisal in her eyes, as if she were constantly inspecting the world for flaws. When she walked her small white dog in the mornings, she would pause in front of houses, making notes on a clipboard she sometimes carried. For years she had been the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards. If a fence needed painting, she was the one to bring it up at the monthly meetings. If someone parked a trailer on the street, she would call within the hour. The power she wielded wasn't official in the way of a badge or title from the city, but it was potent all the same. Her position as president of the HOA gave her authority over the things most homeowners cared about: fines, approvals for improvements, and access to the community's shared amenities. Many neighbors treated her with polite smiles, eager to stay off her radar, but behind closed doors they rolled their eyes at her relentless policing. From his front window the new homeowner had noticed her before he even moved in. The way she directed delivery trucks, the way she gestured sharply at kids playing too close to her lawn, it all hinted at someone who believed rules existed for other people to follow, and for her to enforce. He didn't think much of it then. Every neighborhood had someone like that, he told himself. Someone who liked order, but he didn't yet understand the way her presence could seep into daily life. Her SUV, a glossy black vehicle that seemed always freshly washed, was as much a part of her identity as her clipboard. It sat in the driveway like a symbol of her status, big enough to command space on the street. Neighbors joked quietly about how it was her chariot of authority. Children knew to steer clear when they saw it coming. Adults knew it meant the enforcer was on patrol. To the new homeowner, it was just another car at first, parked across from his fresh, green lawn, nothing more. She begins cutting across his yard with her SUV as a shortcut. It started subtly, almost like an accident. One afternoon while he was unpacking boxes, he heard the crunch of tires on grass. Looking up he saw the black SUV making a wide turn out of her driveway, and clipping the corner of his yard. The tires left faint impressions in the soil, nothing more than a couple of soft ruts. He told himself it wasn't worth fussing over. Perhaps she had misjudged the angle. The yard was still new, the edges not yet defined by borders or posts. So maybe she hadn't realized she was on his property. But it didn't stop there. The next morning, from the kitchen window he watched the same SUV cut diagonally across the edge of his lawn again, its wheels dipping slightly before climbing back onto the street. This time the tracks were deep. Over the following days it became routine. She would reverse out of her driveway, swing the SUV in a tight arc, and slice across the grass instead of using the street like everyone else. The path of her tires became more visible with each pass, dark parallel lines against the green he had worked so hard to cultivate. He tried to ignore it at first. After all, confronting the HOA president felt like inviting trouble. Yet each time he saw those tracks, a slow frustration built in his chest. This wasn't a neighbor's dog leaving paw prints, or a kid cutting across with a bike. This was a 2-ton vehicle pressing ruts into soil he had aerated by hand, breaking the clean lines he had spent hours mowing. He began to notice small clumps of grass uprooted where the tires bit into damp earth after rain. The edge of his lawn looked ragged, chewed up in a way that stood out from the rest of the yard's neatness. On weekends while watering or trimming, he would glance up and see her watching him from her porch, her expression unreadable. It was as though she was daring him to say something. Or perhaps she didn't think of it at all, because to her the lawn wasn't his sanctuary, just another patch of ground in the neighborhood she managed. Neighbors walking past slowed their steps, eyes flicking from the tracks to his face, sensing tension but saying nothing. He began to feel a mixture of disbelief and insult. He had put his sweat, time and money into creating something beautiful, and here was the very person who upheld neighborhood standards casually damaging it day after day. Each time he repaired the soil and reseeded, she drove over it again. Each time he straightened the edge, the tires carved new grooves. What had once been his source of pride was starting to feel like a symbol of powerlessness, a canvas being defaced in plain sight. At first he politely asks her to stop driving over his grass. One cool evening, as the sun dipped low and threw orange light across the neighborhood, he finally decided to speak up. He had been watching her black SUV trace its now familiar arc across his lawn for days, each pass leaving the grass a little more battered. He waited until she stepped out of her car with her little white dog tucked under one arm, clipboard in the other hand, and called out across the street. His voice was steady but friendly, the way you'd address any neighbor when you're trying to keep things light. He said her name, smiled, and explained that he'd been putting a lot of time into his lawn. He told her he'd noticed the SUV sometimes clipped the corner when she was leaving her driveway, and that the tracks were starting to damage the grass. He asked if she could swing a little wider onto the street instead. For a second, she didn't seem to hear him. She clipped the dog's leash onto its collar, set the clipboard on her porch rail, and finally looked over. Her expression was unreadable but her voice came sharp and short. It's just a bit of grass. She glanced at the tire marks and then back at him, eyebrows raised, as though she couldn't believe he'd bring it up. He kept his tone light, explaining how much work it had taken to get the lawn looking the way it did. He said he was sure it wasn't intentional, just a matter of habit, but that he'd really appreciate it if she avoided cutting the corner. The conversation felt like walking on a tightrope. He wanted to be firm but not confrontational, especially because she wasn't just any neighbor. She was the one who held the HOA gavel. She gave a short laugh, the kind that sounded less like amusement and more like dismissal, and said she'd see what she could do. Then she turned back to her dog, gave it a little tug, and walked down the sidewalk without another word. He stood there on his lawn, unsure if the matter was resolved or simply brushed aside. That night, he replayed the exchange in his head. He told himself he'd done the right thing, he'd been calm, he'd been respectful, and he'd made his case. Maybe she hadn't realized how often she was doing it. Maybe tomorrow she'd make the adjustment, and this would be nothing more than a blip in the otherwise peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood. He even went out with a rake and gently brushed the grass back into place, tamping down the ridges with his foot, hopeful that it wouldn't happen again. The next morning, while sipping coffee at the kitchen window, he heard the familiar crunch of tires on soil. There it was again, the black SUV cutting across, the back wheels sinking slightly, the grass flattening under the weight. This time she didn't even look at the house. She simply drove off down the street, as though his words the night before had evaporated into the evening air. He felt his jaw tighten. He told himself to stay calm, that habits take time to change. But as the days passed and nothing changed, he began to sense that her response had not been a promise at all but a dismissal. Still, he tried again. The second time he approached her, it was on a Saturday morning. She was pruning her hedges, a pair of gleaming shears snipping rhythmically. He walked over, hands in pockets, and mentioned the tracks again. He said it in a soft tone, careful not to sound accusatory, explaining that the damage was getting worse and that reseeding and leveling were costing him both time and money. She barely paused her snipping. "It's not that big a deal," she said without looking at him. "The grass will grow back." He swallowed his frustration and nodded, retreating back to his side of the street. She ignores his requests and continues daily. What began as irritation began turning into something heavier. Day after day, at roughly the same times, the SUV rolled out of her driveway and carved its familiar track across his hard-won lawn. The path became so ingrained that even when she wasn't there, he could see the ghost of her tires etched into the green like a scar. He started to notice little details that made the act feel deliberate. The way she angled her wheels long before reaching the street, the steady speed with which she crossed, the slight jolt of her suspension as she dipped off the curb onto his soil. If she had wanted to stop, she easily could have. He began keeping his phone nearby whenever he heard her engine start. Through the blinds he would record small clips, silent, shaky videos of her SUV crunching over his grass, and then pulling away. Each clip was like a small piece of evidence, a way to convince himself he wasn't imagining the disrespect. In the evenings he'd scroll through them, jaw tight, wondering what to do next. The damage became harder to mask. Where there had once been soft, springy blades of grass, there were now two parallel streaks of compacted soil. After a rain, the tracks turned to mud, and when they dried, the grass grew back patchy and weak. He tried everything, sprinkling fresh seed, laying straw, watering more frequently. But each time the tires came back and undid his work. The corner of the yard began to look like a construction site rather than a home. What stung most was the inversion of role. She was supposed to be the enforcer of neighborhood standards, the one who kept everyone else in line. Yet here she was openly damaging someone else's property. The hypocrisy grated at him. He would see her at HOA meetings, or walking her dog, and hear her lecturing others about keeping their fences painted or their bushes trimmed. And meanwhile his lawn bore the evidence of her own disregard. He tried subtle measures. One evening he set small tasteful solar lights along the edge of the grass, hoping the glow at night would mark the boundary and discourage her. By the next morning, one of the lights was tilted at an odd angle, knocked aside as if a tire had brushed it. Another day he placed a short plastic border he'd bought from the garden center. Nothing tall enough to damage a car but high enough to signal this is not part of the street. Within a week, 2 sections were flattened, tire marks cutting right through. Neighbors began to note. A woman walking her dog one morning slowed down to watch as the SUV rolled off the driveway and across the grass. She gave him a sympathetic look, but kept walking. Kids riding bikes veered around the ruts, pointing and whispering. He could feel the story of his lawn spreading in quiet conversations across the street. But no one wanted to confront the HOA president. Everyone knew she had a long memory when it came to grievances. For him, the sense of violation grew heavy. He had built the lawn with his own hands, each blade of grass a small act of ownership. And now it was being undone in front of him day after day. He began waking up earlier, just to watch, standing at the window in the half-light, as her headlights flickered on and the SUV eased down the drive. The pattern had become ritual. She crossed, he watched. The grass yielded. Each time it happened, he felt a small flare of anger, a pulse of helplessness. At night he lay awake, thinking about it. The glow of his phone screen illuminating the video clips he'd taken. He thought about the hours he'd spent working the soil, the money he'd spent at the garden center, the pride he'd felt looking out at something he had created. Now that pride felt brittle, chipped away by tires he hadn't invited. He thought about the way she had laughed the first time he spoke up, the way she had dismissed him without even pausing her pruning. The tracks on his lawn had become tracks in his mind, grooves of frustration deepening each day she ignored his request. Tire marks start ruining his once perfect lawn. What had begun as faint impressions deepened into harsh grooves that no amount of raking could disguise. The soft green carpet he had nurtured with his own hands now bore the weight of someone else's indifference. After each rainstorm the soil turned to mud, splashing up onto the healthy grass and staining it brown. And when the sun returned the mud hardened into cracked lines that split the lawn like scars. He would come home from work, step out of his car, and his eyes would go first to that corner where the damage grew. He tried reseeding, laying straw, even pressing the dirt back down with a tamper. But the weight of the SUV undid it all within days. The edge of his property no longer looked like part of a home, but like a path through an abandoned lot. It was as if his hours of labor and pride were being erased one tire track at a time, leaving behind a visible reminder of how little his requests seemed to matter. Neighbors who had once complimented his work began to avoid commenting, glancing quickly at the damage, and then at him with awkward sympathy. Each streak felt like a signature of disrespect, a daily message carved into the earth. The man documents the damage with photos and video. He began keeping his phone in his pocket whenever he was outside, ready to capture the moment the SUV made its routine cut across the grass. At first he took wide shots showing the whole corner of the yard with the tracks etched deep. Then he started taking close-ups, focusing on uprooted clumps of sod, muddy imprints of tire treads, and the gradual widening of the path. Early in the mornings, he would position himself at the kitchen window, the blinds tilted just enough to record without being obvious, and wait for the engine to start. Each clip he saved into a folder labeled simply lawn. Sometimes he added the date. Sometimes he zoomed in on the SUV's license plate. But mostly he just recorded the same slow violation over and over. In the evenings he would scroll through the images, watching the timeline of destruction like a flipbook. The photos were his proof, not just for others but for himself. Evidence that he wasn't imagining the damage, or exaggerating the impact. With every picture the grooves in the ground became deeper, the grass thinner, his frustration heavier, and the sense of unfairness sharp. He brings the issue up at an HOA meeting but is dismissed publicly. When the next homeowners association meeting rolled around, he decided to take his evidence and speak up in a formal setting. He arrived early, sitting at the end of a long folding table in the community clubhouse with his phone and a small stack of printed photos. When it was time for open comments, he stood and calmly explained what had been happening to his lawn. He showed the pictures, described the damage, and asked if the HOA could remind residents to respect property boundaries. For a moment the room went quiet, people shifting in their seats. Then the president, seated at the head of the table, gave a small laugh and waved a hand as if swatting away a fly. "It's just grass," she said, her voice carrying across the room. A few people chuckled nervously. Others looked down at their papers, and the agenda quickly moved on. Neighbors whisper about the ongoing feud between the two. After that meeting, the story began to spread in low voices along sidewalks and driveways. People who had once simply waved, now lingered to exchange glances, murmuring about the lawn thing or the feud with the HOA. Some speculated about what had happened, some asked cautious questions, but most simply treated it as neighborhood gossip, a small drama playing out on their street. Children mentioned it to their parents after seeing the man filming from his window. Couples walking their dogs would pause and glance at the ruts in the grass before moving on, whispering to each other about how bold he was to confront her and how strange it was that nothing changed. The HOA president escalates by mocking him in front of others. It started with subtle digs, slipped into conversations, when other neighbors were nearby. She would stand at the edge of her driveway with her dog on its leash and a small circle of residents around her, discussing the usual topics of trash pickup or holiday decoration, and then casually mention certain people who make a fuss about grass, or can't handle a little tire mark. The words were delivered with a half-smile, but the meaning was unmistakable. More than once he caught her glancing deliberately in his direction while she spoke, her tone dripping with the kind of amusement meant to put someone in their place without ever saying their name. Some neighbors laughed politely, some shifted uncomfortably, but none intervened. The more she did it, the bolder she became. At one point, during an informal gathering on a neighbor's porch, she raised her voice so that it carried across the street and said, "Some people think their lawn is more important than community spirit." Laughter bubbled up from the group, a few eyes darted to his yard, and he stood at his window gripping the curtain, feeling the sting of being turned into a public joke. She began framing his complaints as petty and overblown, telling anyone who would listen that she had barely touched his property and that he was overreacting. She used the language of rules and regulations to make it sound as though she had the authority to decide what mattered. The stories she told about him grew more exaggerated each time she repeated them. At one point he overheard her telling a new resident that he had screamed at her in the street, something that had never happened, but the new resident nodded as if it were fact. The way she spoke painted him as a troublemaker, the opposite of the careful, respectful person he tried to be. Her attitude spilled over into meetings as well. If he raised a hand to speak, she would interrupt or roll her eye. Once while he was describing the damage to his lawn in front of a small committee, she leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and whispered something to the person next to her, who snickered. The sound echoed in the otherwise quiet room, making his face burn with embarrassment. She had found a way to shift the narrative from one of property damage to one of him being the difficult neighbor, the one who made everything a big deal. In doing so, she made it harder for him to get sympathy or support from others, who didn't want to risk becoming the next target of her ridicule. He noticed the effect immediately. Neighbors who had once nodded sympathetically at his yard, now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he approached. People smiled too brightly, or not at all. It was as if she had built an invisible fence around him, isolating him socially the way her SUV had carved physical lines through his lawn. Each mockery she delivered chipped away not only at his reputation but at his sense of belonging. He found himself hesitating before stepping outside, wondering who might be watching, who might be laughing later. Even mundane tasks like watering the plants or taking out the trash began to feel like walking onto a stage where someone else controlled the script. He tries installing small signs asking people not to drive over his property. After weeks of seeing his efforts ignored and his reputation quietly undermined, he decided to take a direct but non-confrontational approach. One Saturday morning, he went to a hardware store and bought a handful of small but sturdy signs. They weren't aggressive or even particularly large, just neat white placards on short posts with a polite message printed in black: "Please do not drive on grass." He chose the wording carefully, avoiding anything that might seem accusatory. He wanted it to look like a simple boundary marker, not a declaration of war. He placed the signs evenly along the edge of the lawn where the SUV usually cut across. Kneeling in the soil with a mallet, he drove each post deep enough to withstand wind and rain, then stepped back to survey the row. For the first time in weeks he felt a small measure of relief, as if he had drawn a quiet line without needing to raise his voice. The signs stood straight and visible, their message clear to anyone approaching from her driveway. Passers-by slowed to read them, some nodding, some raising eyebrows. A few offered him encouraging smiles, the kind that said they understood even if they didn't want to get involved. That evening he watched from the window as the HOA president came home. Her SUV rolled up, headlights washing over the new signs, and paused for a moment as though she were taking them in. Then she drove on without incident, pulling into her driveway with no comment. He allowed himself a flicker of hope that maybe this simple gesture would be enough to end the daily damage, that seeing the polite message would break the habit. But within days the signs became another front in the quiet conflict. One morning he stepped outside to find one of them leaning at an odd angle, the post bent where a tire had clipped it. Another was missing entirely, leaving only a small hole in the ground where it had been. A third lay flat on its face, the stakes snapped. He replaced them, straightened them, but the pattern repeated. Sometimes the signs disappeared overnight, sometimes they reappeared a few feet away as if someone had yanked them out and tossed them aside. He began waking up early to check the line, feeling the same frustration he had felt with the tire tracks now shifting to these small markers of his boundary. It wasn't just the SUV anymore, it was a slow erosion of his right to even signal his property as his own. Each missing or damaged sign felt like a message: your boundaries don't matter. Neighbors noticed the sign's changing state but said nothing, and when he caught someone's eye they would quickly look away, unwilling to be drawn into the dispute. At night he would gather the bent stakes in his garage, laying them out like casualties of a small war. The polite black letters, once crisp, became scuffed and dirty. Some were cracked from the pressure of being run over. Still he kept buying replacements, refusing to give up the gesture even as it was undermined. It was the only way he knew to assert his space without yelling or escalating further, a quiet stand for respect. Each new sign he planted carried not just a message for drivers but a small hope that someone, anyone, would see what was happening and understand the kind of strain it placed on him. The signs are mysteriously removed overnight. He had expected some pushback, but the swiftness with which the signs vanished still caught him off guard. One evening he went to bed after checking that each placard stood straight and visible along the edge of the lawn. By dawn the next morning 2 were missing, their stakes gone as if they had never been there at all. The soil was still loose where he had pressed them in, small holes gaping like open mouths. He walked the perimeter of the yard, scanning the street and the hedges, half hoping to see them tossed somewhere nearby, but there was nothing. The polite black letters he had carefully chosen had disappeared into the night without a trace. He replaced them that afternoon, hammering the new stakes in deeper, determined not to be discouraged. Yet the pattern repeated itself. Some nights the signs simply vanished, other nights they were found lying flat, pushed over with enough force to crack the post. Once he discovered one jammed under the wheel of his garbage bin at the curb, its message smeared with mud. Another time one was broken clean in 2 and left on his porch like a taunt. It was no longer just about preventing tire tracks. It had become a quiet, unsettling game of erasure. Every time he planted a sign he felt he was making a statement. This is my space. Please respect it. And every time one disappeared, he felt that statement being erased by someone who wanted him to know his boundaries meant nothing. He started to double-check his locks at night. He left his porch light on later, and later, he caught himself glancing out the window whenever a car slowed down, his heart thudding as he imagined someone sneaking across his yard under cover of darkness. Neighbors noticed but pretended not to. In daylight they walked past his signposts, saw the new gaps where placards had been, and quickened their pace. Some gave him small, sympathetic looks, but no one said a word. It was as if the entire street had entered into a silent pact, not to challenge the unspoken power at work. Even those who privately disapproved of the president's behavior did not want to cross her. She was the gatekeeper of approvals, the arbiter of fines, and her disfavor could ripple into every part of neighborhood life. He began keeping a log, scribbling dates and times into a small notebook. Monday, 2 signs gone. Thursday, 1 knocked over. Saturday, found 1 broken. He saved each damaged stake in a corner of the garage, their bent metal and splintered wood piling up like physical proof of the unseen hands undermining him. When he looked at the growing collection he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. The signs had been a simple, polite request. Nothing. He wasn't building a fence or putting up cameras. He was asking for a basic level of respect. Yet even that small request was being stripped away from him night after night. It began to wear on him physically. He woke earlier than usual, scanning the lawn before sunrise. His sleep grew restless. He found himself tense at work, distracted by thoughts of what might be happening back at home. He wondered if he should stay up one night and watch, but the idea of sitting in the dark with a camera felt like crossing some unseen line he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. He wanted to believe that reasonable behavior would eventually prevail, that this was all just a misunderstanding taken too far, but each missing sign was a quiet confirmation that reason was no longer part of the equation. Out of frustration, he decides to take matters into his own hands. By the time the last of the signs disappeared, something in him shifted. The polite conversations, the patient receding, the carefully worded placards, none of it had worked.
Each step he had taken to assert his boundary had been met with more dismissal, more damage, more erasure. Standing on his porch one evening, looking at the rutted edge of his lawn and the empty spaces where the signs had been, he felt a hard resolve settle over him. He was tired of being the one who compromised, tired of watching his work He began researching quietly, late at night on his phone. He looked up property rights, local ordinances, creative ways to protect lawns without building fences. He read forums where other homeowners described similar problems, absorbing their stories, their successes, their warnings. The more he read, the more he realized how common his situation was, and how often it ended only when the homeowner took action on their own. He weighed each option carefully, imagining how it would look, how it would feel, how it might escalate the conflict. He didn't want confrontation, but he also didn't want to keep losing. He thought about cameras, about tall stakes, about small decorative boulders, but each idea felt either too obvious or too easy to remove. What he needed was something that would stop the damage without turning his yard into a fortress. He wanted to draw a boundary that couldn't be ignored, a quiet, but undeniable line between his property and the street. In the weeks that followed, he began preparing in secret. He worked in the early mornings before work, and after sunset, when the street was quieter. He measured distances, marked subtle lines in the soil, made small purchases at different stores so nothing would look suspicious. Each act felt like reclaiming a piece of his power, a small step toward restoring the respect his property deserved. The neighbors who passed by saw only a man tending his lawn as usual, but inside he felt a new determination building, a sense that he was no longer just reacting but planning. His garage became a workshop of sorts, tools and materials neatly arranged in a way that looked like ordinary yard maintenance, but carried a different intent. He moved deliberately, checking and rechecking his work. He told no one what he was doing, not even the few acquaintances who still offered him sympathetic glances. He knew that the less people knew, the less chance there was for gossip to reach the president's ear. As he worked, he thought about the hours he had spent on this patch of earth, the sweat and money poured into making it beautiful. He thought about the dismissive laugh, the tire tracks, the vanished signs. Each memory fed the quiet resolve in his chest. He didn't see himself as plotting revenge, but as defending what was his, taking the only path left after every polite attempt had been ignored. The process of planning and preparing gave him a kind of calm focus he hadn't felt in months. He was no longer waiting for someone else to do the right thing. He was taking control of his own space in the only way he could think to do it.
He discreetly installs hidden spikes beneath the grass along the edge of his property. The plan he settled on was quiet, invisible, and effective. It began with a trip to a supply store where he bought narrow metal strips designed to keep animals from digging in gardens, small enough to be buried just under the surface, but strong enough to deter anything heavy rolling over them. He brought them home in the trunk of his car covered by a tarp so no one could see. Over the next few evenings, while the neighborhood was distracted by dinner and television, he worked outside in worn gloves, kneeling at the edge of his lawn as if he were simply tending to the soil. A small trowel became his tool of choice, cutting thin slits into the ground where the tire tracks had carved their path. Into each slit he slid a strip, aligning it carefully so that it sat just below the blades of grass, invisible to the casual eye. Then he pressed the turf back into place and brushed it with his hand, erasing all sign of disturbance. From the street, nothing looked different. The grass appeared just as it had before, green and soft under the fading light. Only he knew that beneath the surface a new boundary had been set, not a wall but a line of tiny teeth waiting quietly. He moved slowly and methodically, measuring distances, spacing the strips evenly so they would form a continuous barrier along the area most often driven over. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, the way someone might lay a brick path or plant a row of seeds. When headlights occasionally passed on the street, he would pause, leaning back on his heels as though simply weeding, until the car moved on. He took care to ensure the spikes wouldn't harm pedestrians or children. They were low enough to sit flush with the soil, and only protruded upward under the weight of something heavy like a vehicle. It wasn't about hurting anyone, it was about stopping the damage. Each piece he laid felt like reclaiming a little more of his space, a quiet defense where words and signs had failed. By the time he finished, a subtle line ran along the edge of his property, invisible yet firm, a silent signal that the lawn was not an extension of the street. When he stood up and wiped the dirt from his hands, he felt a strange calm wash over him. For months he had been reacting, trying to patch damage, trying to persuade someone who refused to listen. Now he had acted. The boundary was there whether she saw it or not, a hidden answer to a public problem. He gathered his tools, stored the leftover strips in a box on a high shelf in the garage, and looked once more at the grass that had become his battleground. One morning, the HOA president's SUV gets a flat tire after crossing his yard. The morning it happened began like so many others. The sky was pale and streaked with early sunlight. The street quiet except for the faint hum of sprinklers and bird song. He stood at the kitchen window, mug of coffee in hand, watching the scene with the practiced stillness of someone who had done the same for weeks. Across the street, the black SUV reversed out of the driveway. It moved with its usual confidence, angled slightly toward the corner of his yard just as it always had. He felt his stomach tighten but kept his face blank, eyes fixed on the familiar pattern. The vehicle rolled forward, its tires dipping off the curb onto the grass. For a heartbeat, everything looked the same, the weight pressing into the green, the faint movement of soil under rubber. Then there was a muffled crunch, a sound not of grass but of something giving way. The SUV lurched slightly, its front wheel sinking deeper than usual. A hiss followed, long and unmistakable. The driver braked, the vehicle coming to an abrupt stop half on the lawn, half in the street. From the window he could see her head turn, confusion flickering across her posture. She opened the door, stepped out in her neat blazer and shoes, and looked down at the front tire. Even from a distance he could see it sagging, air rushing out in a slow, steady stream. For a moment she simply stared, as though unable to understand how her routine had been interrupted. Then she bent closer, running her hand over the rubber, glancing at the ground beneath. He saw her eyes travel over the grass, but of course there was nothing to see. No obvious trap, no sign of what lay hidden beneath. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains twitching, doors open. A man walking his dog slowed and stopped, watching as she straightened and placed her hands on her hips. Another neighbor came out onto his porch pretending to water a plant, but clearly observing. The street held a strange, charged stillness. She reached into the SUV for her phone, pacing a small circle as she spoke into it, her gestures sharp with disbelief. The dog walker whispered something under his breath. Someone else across the way lifted a phone and snapped a photo. In the span of a few minutes the situation had transformed from a private irritation to a public spectacle. Her black SUV, once a symbol of her control, now sat wounded on the very patch of ground she had treated like an extension of the road. He remained at his window, coffee cooling in his hands, face unreadable. He had not shouted, had not run outside to gloat, had not done anything but watch. All the months of frustration, of polite requests ignored, of signs removed and reputation chipped away, seemed to converge in that single tableau. The president of the HOA standing on his damaged lawn, looking at her deflated tire, while neighbors gathered at the edges of their property lines to see what would happen next. The sound of air leaking from the tire was steady and soft, like a whisper carrying across the morning. She storms over furious, but neighbors start siding with him after seeing the evidence. The hiss of the deflating tire had barely faded before she was striding across the street, her expression no longer confused but blazing with anger. Her shoes clicked sharply on the pavement, as she marched straight up his walkway without an invitation. She didn't knock, she jabbed at the doorbell repeatedly, each press like a demand. When he opened the door she was already speaking, her voice pitched high with indignation, accusing him of sabotaging her vehicle, of endangering her safety, of breaking HOA rule. Her words tumbled out in a rapid stream, each one sharper than the last. He listened without interrupting, his hands resting loosely at his sides, face calm. When she paused to draw breath, he spoke evenly, asking her to step back from his doorway and lower her voice. He said he hadn't touched her car, that he had only tried for months to protect his property, that he had photographs and videos showing every instance of her SUV crossing the lawn despite his polite requests. She scoffed and demanded proof. Without a word, he reached for his phone and pulled up the folder labeled lawn, scrolling through clip after clip, date-stamped images of her vehicle rolling over the same strip of grass day after day. The transformation on her face was subtle, but visible. The high color in her cheeks remained, but her eyes flicked over the screen, darting to the neighbors who were now openly gathering at the edge of his yard. The dog walker had stopped completely, holding his pet on a short leash while he watched. The man who had been watering his plants had stepped closer, arms crossed. A couple from down the street stood whispering to each other, glancing from the sagging tire to the photos on the phone. What had once been a private dispute was now a tableau of evidence and consequence unfolding in the open. She tried to recover her composure, claiming the videos were misleading, that the lawn was practically part of the road, that she had every right to swing wide in her own neighborhood. But the more she spoke the less certain she sounded. The neighbors' faces were not hostile but curious, some tinged with a kind of vindicated sympathy. They had heard rumors whispered about the feud, but seeing the footage made the story real. A few of them had their own grievances with her strict enforcement of petty rules, and now watched the scene like people seeing a curtain pulled back. He didn't raise his voice, he simply kept the phone steady, letting the images, the grooves in the grass,
The dates on the videos, the repeated arcs of her SUV were all there. Undeniable. The power dynamic that had favored her for so long began to shift in the charged silence of the gathered crowd. Her accusations lost their edge, turning brittle. She straightened her shoulders, muttered something about contacting her insurance company, and stalked back toward her disabled vehicle. Behind her the whispers of the neighbors swelled, small pockets of conversation breaking out as they exchanged what they had just witnessed. The incident sparks a heated community discussion about respecting private property. Later that day the street buzzed with talk. Word of the flat tire and the videos spread faster than he could have imagined. People who had previously stayed out of the conflict now felt emboldened to weigh in. Some stopped by his yard under the guise of chatting about unrelated matters, but ended up asking questions about the damage, the videos, how long it had been going on. Others shook their heads in disbelief at the hypocrisy of the HOA president, damaging a neighbor's property while lecturing them about their own. The next HOA meeting drew an unusually large crowd. Chairs scraped across the floor as residents filled the room, their voices low but animated. When the meeting began, the usual agenda items, landscaping budgets, pool maintenance, were quickly set aside as people began to bring up the incident. They didn't mention the spikes directly, but they spoke about property boundaries, about repeated damage, about the need for clear accountability. Some of the older residents told stories of their own frustrations with people cutting across their lawns or ignoring small rules. A younger couple said they were tired of feeling like they had to tiptoe around the president's demands while she herself ignored the standards she imposed. What had once been whispered gossip now became open testimony. One neighbor said he had seen the SUV cross the lawn countless times. Another admitted she had wanted to complain about the president's behavior, but had been afraid of retaliation. The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. The president sat stiffly at the head of the table, her usual air of authority replaced by a tight smile. She tried to steer the conversation back to the agenda, but the momentum had shifted. People were no longer talking about a patch of grass. They were talking about fairness, about respect, about double standards. He sat quietly near the back. Listen. He hadn't come to gloat but to see whether the truth would finally be heard. As residents spoke he felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Months of being ignored, mocked, and isolated had led to this moment where the community itself began to acknowledge what had happened. Even those who still liked the president seemed uncomfortable defending her. The discussion grew animated, voices overlapping as people debated how the HOA should handle conflicts between members, how rules should apply equally to everyone, and whether changes were needed to prevent similar situations in the future. By the end of the meeting, nothing official had been decided, but the atmosphere was unmistakably different. People who had once avoided eye contact with him now came over to shake his hand, or pat his shoulder. They spoke words like sorry and unfair and about time. The narrative of him as the petty complainer had begun to crumble, replaced by a picture of a neighbor who had been patient, polite and finally forced to protect his own property when all else failed. Outside in the parking lot small groups lingered, still talking, their voices carrying a sense of possibility as if something fundamental in the neighborhood dynamic had shifted. The HOA eventually backs down, and new rules are put in place to prevent future conflict. In the weeks that followed, the tension that had once felt like a permanent feature of the street began to loosen. The flat tire became a kind of turning point everyone referenced when talking about neighborhood issues. At first the president tried to resume business as usual, sending out routine notices about trash bins or mailbox paint. But fewer and fewer people took her memos seriously. Homeowners who had once obeyed her instructions out of fear of fines now began to question them openly. Some asked for receipts, some requested to see the bylaws in writing, and others simply ignored minor demands. Behind the scenes the board members, many of whom had been her allies for years, began to distance themselves. At an informal gathering, one of them admitted to him that they had underestimated how bad the situation had become, and how damaging it looked to the association's credibility. The next scheduled meeting included an item on the agenda about clarification of property use, but it quickly evolved into a broader discussion of the HOA's powers and responsibility. Residents stood and said plainly that the president's repeated trespassing had been unacceptable, that the handling of his complaints had been negligent, and that the community wanted a fairer process. By the end of the night, a vote passed to create a new policy, requiring the board to respond in writing to any property damage complaint within a set number of days. Another rule limited how far vehicles could enter private lawns and gave homeowners the explicit right to install non-harmful deterrents to protect their property. It wasn't everything he had imagined, but it was a public acknowledgement that his struggle had not been in vain. The very organization that had dismissed him was now codifying the respect he had been asking for all along, turning his personal fight into a safeguard for everyone on the street. Long after the policies were written, and the board reshuffled, the story continued to ripple outward. New residents moving in heard about the lawn incident before they even unpacked boxes. Children whispered about the hidden spikes as if they were part of a secret defense system. Older neighbors recounted how he had stayed calm under pressure and documented everything, how he had turned the tables on the most powerful person on the block without shouting or grand gestures. People began to approach him differently. Where once they had given him wary looks or avoided his gaze, now they nodded, smiled, or stopped to chat. They asked for tips on lawn care, on handling disputes, on navigating HOA bureaucracy. Some treated him almost like an informal advisor, someone who had learned the hard way how to stand his ground without losing his composure. Even those who had kept their distance during the conflict now spoke to him with warmth, saying they admired how he had handled things. The atmosphere on the street shifted too. Neighbors were more mindful of where they parked, more careful about the edges of each other's property, quicker to apologize if they overstepped. The sense of quiet surveillance that had once made the neighborhood tense began to soften into a kind of mutual respect. What had started as one man's battle to save a patch of grass had become a living reminder of boundaries, of patience, and of the power of persistence. His lawn recovered, the grass filling in where the ruts had been, but the deeper mark was on the community itself, which now held his story as a cautionary tale and a guide for how to handle disputes with dignity.